Please be seated. The court is now in session. As scheduled for this week's proceeding, the trial chamber will hear the testimony of the expert witness, that is Mr. Philip Short. It's going to be for the 4 days of this proceeding, that is from the 6th to the 9th of May 2013. The trial chamber will have 1 day for questioning the witness. The prosecution and the lead co-lawyers is allocated for 1.5 days. And for the true defense teams, 1.5 day allocated is given. The trial chamber would also like to remind all the parties, including the previous memorandum, that is document E236/4, regarding the expert witness Philip Short, that he could be questioned on all the areas that is able to be responded by him according to his knowledge. The trial chamber, in fact, encouraged all the parties to question the expert based on the severance of case 002 after the decision by the Supreme Court chamber, that is document E284. So the scope for questioning of this witness is rather extensive within case 002. However, all the parties should focus their questioning on the relevant part of the severed cases, in particular case 002/01. Greffier, Mr. Ansan, could you report the attendance of the parties and individuals to today's proceeding? Ansan, Mr. President, for today's proceeding, all parties are present. As for Noon Chia, he is present in the holding cell downstairs. That is according to the decision by the trial chamber due to his health reason. The expert who is going to be testified today, that is TCE 65, Mr. Philip Short. Through his best knowledge, he has no relationship by blood or by law through any of the true accused, that is Noon Chia and Kim Sampon, or any of the civil parties recognized in this case. The expert witness will be testified before the trial chamber and is ready to be called by the chamber. Thank you, Mr. President. President, thank you, Greffier. Court officer, could you invite Mr. Philip Short into the courtroom? President. Good morning, Mr. Philip Short. Is your name Philip Short?
My name is Philip Short.
Thank you. How old are you, Mr. Philip Short?
You asked my age. I'm 68.
Thank you. What is your nationality?
I am British.
Thank you. Where is your current residence?
I live in France, in a small commune called La Garde-Freinet.
Thank you. What is your current occupation?
I am a writer of history and biography.
Thank you. According to the report by the greffier, to your best knowledge, you have no relationship by blood or by law through any other parties in this case. That is, the civil parties and the two accused, Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan. Is this report correct?
It is indeed correct. I have no blood relationship to Mr. Khieu Samphan or Mr. Nuon Chea or to any of the civil parties.
Thank you. According to Rule 31(2) of the internal rules of the ECCC, as an expert to be testified before this court, you are required to make an oath before proceeding with the testimony. Do you consent to that?
I do.
The international greffier, could you proceed with an oath for this expert, Philip Short?
Mr. Short, please repeat after me. I solemnly swear that I will assist the trial chamber honestly, confidentially, and to the best of my ability.
I solemnly swear that I will assist the trial chamber honestly, confidentially, and to the best of my ability.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Philip Short. You have already taken an oath before this chamber. The bench will have some questions for you. Could you please briefly tell us about your education?
I was educated at a public school in Britain and then at Cambridge University, where I studied sciences, natural sciences, and English literature.
Thank you. We noticed that you also worked as an independent journalist for the BBC and also a correspondent for certain cities including Moscow, Beijing, Paris, Tokyo, and Washington. Is this information accurate?
That is correct. I worked much of my life for the BBC as a foreign correspondent. At the same time, I wrote books about individual leaders, about countries, China, the Soviet Union, and I have been writing biography and history since the late 1960s, in other words, for the last 45 years. the two careers, if you like, have gone in parallel. On the one hand, a journalistic career, on the other, a career as a historian and biographer.
After your retirement, you also taught the comparative politics in Iowa. Is that correct?
That is correct. I spent a year as a visiting professor at the University of Iowa from 1997 to 1998.
Thank you. And later on, you focus solely on reading books. How long have you been working as a writer?
I started my first biography in 1968, as I said, late 60s, and it was published in 1974. So I have been writing books for 40 years, 45 years.
Thank you. You have written and published certain books of important figures, including the former leader of the Democratic Cambodia. Could you tell us how come you became interested in the biography of the leader of Democratic Cambodia?
I worked as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent in Beijing in the 1970s. And while I was in Beijing, I got to know the Democratic Kampuchea ambassador, Mr. Pick Chang. I became interested in what was happening in Democratic Kampuchea, in Cambodia. And in September 1977, Pol Pot and Ying Sari and Vorn Vet and Chun Chun visited Beijing. It was their first and only official visit abroad. And I followed Pol Pot from the time he arrived till the time he left. And at that moment, I became particularly interested in what was happening in Cambodia. But all my efforts to obtain a visa from Mr. Pick Chang were unsuccessful, so I could not come.
Thank you. Have you studied the history of Cambodia, in particular the history of Democratic Cambodia?
I have, but I started studying seriously the history of Democratic Kampuchea when I decided to write a biography of Pol Pot. And that followed a biography I wrote of Chairman Mao, the former Chinese leader. After Mao, I was faced with the question, who do I write about next? And it seemed to me a good time to write about Pol Pot. I would simply add that when I write a biography, each book takes 5 or 6 years to research and write. So it's a long-term project.
Thank you. What books have you been written about the regime of democratic Cambodia?
I wrote, which book have I written? I have written one book, a biography of Pol Pot, called The History of a Nightmare, which was published in 2004 in Britain and the United States, and has been published since in other languages.
In your study and research about democratic Cambodia, did you have any opportunity to interview in person with Pol Pot?
I did not interview Pol Pot because by the time I began my book, I started working at the end of 1999, beginning of 1999, and by then he was no longer of this world.
Thank you. Did you ever travel through Cambodia during the regime of democratic Cambodia?
I did not, because, as I said, I was not able to obtain a visa to visit while the regime of democratic Cambodia was in power.
Thank you. I'd like to inquire with judges of the bench if you have any question to be put to this expert witness. Judge Cartwright, please proceed.
Yes, thank you, President. Well, thank you, Mr. Short, for coming to the Tribunal to discuss your book, Pol Pot, The History of a Nightmare, which has been assigned the document number E3/9. For your information, this book is available on the court's case file in English and French only. Consequently, and there is very little translated into Khmer. So when I discuss it with you, I will be referring to page numbers from the English version, and occasionally I will have to read out a long string of numbers which are associated with our electronic system here. Now, just returning very briefly to your qualifications and experience, as amply covered by the President, I just want to make sure that during the time that you followed Pol Pot on his diplomatic mission to Beijing in 1977, can I infer that you never had the opportunity to talk to him or interview him directly? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Now, in your book, you confirm that you interviewed Kyo Sompon and Ieng Sari. Did you ever interview Nuon Chea?
I did not interview Nuon Chea.
Thank you. Now, the interview with Kyo Sompon, was that one single interview, or did it take place over a period of weeks or months as you gathered information? Can you just describe the process to us, please?
I visited Pailin, I think 5 or 6 times over a period of about 18 months. And each time I went, I sent word to Mr. Khieu Samphan that I would like to see him. And I think the 6th time, I had a word back to say he would agree. I explained that I wished to interview him for a book about democratic Kampuchea, a biography. And we spent, I suppose, I can check, it will give the dates in the notes, but roughly I must have seen him 5 or 6 times. Probably 5 times on successive days, and then once on a subsequent visit to Pailin.
So you had a very broad opportunity to discuss the preparations for your biography of Pol Pot during those interviews, and can I also assume that you learned about Khieu Samphan's role in the democratic Kampuchean government during those same interviews?
We talked a lot about the early period. And when I say the early period, that is his time in Paris as a student, Mr. Khieu Samphan's experiences in the 1960s after he returned to Cambodia, the journal that he put out, the L'Observateur. We talked about his school days, when he was at school with Pol Pot in, I think, Kampong Cham. We talked a certain amount about the period of democratic Kampuchea, but I think this is a general remark about the former leaders, Mr. Khieu Samphan. It was also true of Mr. Ieng Sary. They were happy to talk at length about their younger years, but more reticent about the democratic Kampuchea period. Now, for me, as a historian, the earlier years were extremely interesting as well. So I think in that kind of interview, where you are trying to learn about why a person develops as he does, you simply try to draw them out to talk about themselves, and you glean what there is to be gleaned.
After your book on Pol Pot was published, Khieu Samphan published what I will call a monograph, Cambodia's Recent History and the Reasons Behind the Decisions I Made. That is document E3/18. That appears to have been published in late 2003. Have you read that monograph?
I have, yes.
And did you learn, in general, more as the result of reading that monograph than you had learned in your face-to-face interviews with him?
I must say we are talking about a book I last read 10 years ago. I think not. I think what I learned from that monograph, and indeed from some of the sections of my interview with Mr. Khieu Samphan, was more the way he wished to treat that period than necessarily factual information about the period itself. And of course, that also is interesting, the way someone wishes to treat a particular period.
So would it be fair to summarize that as the monograph was his way of putting his record according to his views out into the public, but did not necessarily touch on a lot of the details that, for example, an examination in court might obtain?
I think that's absolutely true. He was giving his perspective, the perspective he wished others to retain.
Kyo Sampon also wrote a book. I'm not clear when it was published, but it's called Considerations on the History of Cambodia from the Early Stage to the Period of Democratic Kampuchea. And we have the 5th chapter, Democratic Kampuchea, under document number E3/16 on the case file. Have you read that chapter in particular, or the book generally?
I'm reluctant to answer one way or the other because, honestly, it doesn't ring a bell. Maybe if it were published in the early 2000s when I was working on my book, I no doubt did come across it. But whether under that title, whether in that form, I don't know.
Now, just to be completely clear, you have never had the opportunity of meeting or discussing events around the democratic Kampuchea regime with Nuon Chea. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to turn to parts of your book. I need to explain to you, Mr. Short, that although your book carries a wealth of material, first, we can't cover it all in detail, and secondly, we have certain limitations of time and so on in relation to the period that we are considering in the context of this trial. So I'm going to focus on a particular part, and I'm sure the parties, the prosecutors, the lawyers for the civil parties and the defence will touch on other parts as well. I want to start first with the impressions or what you wrote concerning the last 18 months to 2 years before the evacuation of Phnom Penh. And I want to start in 1973 when you said at English page 218, English ERN 0039648 and French 0063973 to 737. And you note at that part of your book that Pol Pot ordered an all-out assault on Phnom Penh. Now, can you tell me a little about that assault? What time of year was it?
You forgive me, you said page 218?
Yes.
That is not what I have in my copy at 218.
Oh dear. Well, let me just see if I can find the reference then.
I'm finding something around page 249.
So I do apologise. Very bad to be caught out with the wrong reference first up, isn't it? But yes, you're right. It's 249, page 249. So I would like to know when what time of year it was that this assault took place.
It was during the summer, during the rainy season, and that was, made militarily not a lot of sense, but the rationale for it was that the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot in particular wished to show that they could obtain victory before the U.S. bombing runs ended. Because if they could take Phnom Penh while the United States was still bombing Cambodia, it would be a way of showing that they could defeat all that the Americans could throw against them.
And just to record when the US bombing stopped, it was during that year, was it not? And can you confirm the month?
It was in August 1973.
Now, from what you've said already about this rainy season attack on Phnom Penh, I infer that it failed. It was not successful.
It was not successful.
Now, in subsequent pages, that is subsequent to page 249, at page 251, for example, you discuss some of the consequences of that first assault on Phnom Penh. First of all, I'm interested in the supply of arms to the Khmer Rouge forces. Can you discuss that briefly?
The Cambodians were getting, the Khmer Rouge were getting supplies from the Vietnamese and also from China. But a lot of the arms they procured were bought from the Lon Nol forces or from corrupt officers in the Lon Nol government.
In fact, the Vietnamese had, before this time, interrupted their supply of munitions to the Khmer Rouge, and this was, in fact, a reinstatement of arms supply. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Why then did they decide in late 1973 to begin supplying arms again?
Because they were faced with a fait accompli. The Vietnamese would have liked the Khmer Rouge to remain a subsidiary ally. And by 1973, late 1972, early 1973, the Vietnamese found that the Khmer Rouge were becoming sufficiently powerful and occupying sufficiently large areas of Cambodian territory that they had to make a choice. Either they continue to try to force the Khmer Rouge to heed Hanoi's will, or they had to start treating them as allies who would eventually win victory in Cambodia, more or less no matter what the Vietnamese did. And in 1973, middle of 1973, they realized that they were going to have to treat them more as allies. The word equals, I think, is putting it too strongly, but therefore the arms supplies quietly resumed.
And you mentioned that one of their reasons for the resumption of the supply of arms was that the Khmer Rouge controlled more and more territory. At that same page 251, you say that by late 1973, the Khmer Rouge controlled more than 2/3 of Cambodia's territory and almost half its population. Can you tell me how you would find such information? Was this from your study generally for the purpose of the book, or did it come from someone like Kyo Sampon or your other interviewees?
No, this did not come from Kyo Sampon or from interviews. It came from the archival material of the Americans, who knew pretty clearly what was happening in Cambodia, and it was their estimate that 2/3 of the country and half the population was in Khmer Rouge hands.
Now, you mention another consequence of this attack, this unsuccessful attack on Phnom Penh in late 1973, and that is that Pol Pot, who, according to your book, had been moving closer and closer and closer to the capital over the years since 1970, in fact moved very close to Phnom Penh. You say about 30 kilometres northwest of Phnom Penh on the Udong Pursat Road. Can you give me the source? Is it the same general source from the Americans, or was it some other source?
My recollection is that some of that information came from Nikorn, who was Son Sen's brother, and a lot of it came from my own travels in that area, talking to villagers who had been there at that time and remembered where Pol Pot and other leaders were, who remembered where Thuen Thuen set up a hospital, where the forward military command headquarters at Rasmak was, and so on. So, yes, initially interviews, but afterwards going onto the terrain and talking to the villagers about what they remembered.
During the time that he was stationed in that area just northwest of Phnom Penh, you mention a number of decisions that Pol Pot made, starting at bottom of page 252 and going into page 253. The ERNs for which are English 003 96453 and the French 006 39 781 to 782. The first of those decisions you mention was to effectively impose a siege of Phnom Penh. The second was that security was tightened around Phnom Penh. The third was that more methods of controlling enemies were established, such as the building of prisons and re-education and killings. Now, dealing with those three decisions, can you tell me where you learned that information from?
Well, to take the middle question first, the tightening of security from Kung Dong, who was I tell the story of Kung Dong. He became a Khmer Rouge cadre. I met him in Pailin, and he described his experiences when he went from Phnom Penh into the special zone and was lucky to get away with his life because somebody recognized him and could vouch for him, and that the guide who had taken him across from the government-controlled area to the Khmer Rouge area was not so lucky. He was not recognized and he was killed because there was immense suspicion of anybody coming from Phnom Penh. And I mention, it's a curious anecdote, but a French journalist who was at that time in Phnom Penh and had relations with, had known some of the Khmer Rouge when they were students in Paris, a man called Serge Tillon, went into that area, and in the DC Cam files, there is a copy of a police report, a very accurate police report, describing how he reached the area. Now, Serge Tillon's visit was before the strengthening of security, and the significance of it was that if the Lon Nol police had an accurate account of how he went there, what he did, it meant that there were Lon Nol spies operating in the Khmer Rouge area in the special zone. So that was the source for that. The other material, some of it certainly is from confessions from Tuol Sleng, which, if read carefully, can be a very interesting source of information. The decision to tighten the noose around Phnom Penh, gosh, where did that come from? I can't actually, I must be honest, I can't remember the sources for that. But the point about a book like this is that it is really a mosaic of tiny grains of information that you try to put together. And if you ask me now, I'm not always able to tell you exactly where it came from.
Another consequence of this attack on Phnom Penh and the tightening of control around it by the Khmer Rouge was what you have described as other movements of population. And you speak, for example, of Kratie being evacuated in the second half of 1973, and the Khmer Rouge attacking Kampong Cham, driving 15,000 town dwellers from their homes and forcing them to accompany them to liberated zones. That's mentioned 2 pages further on at 257. And at page 255, you talk about the attack on Udong. The ERNs for that are 003964555, French 0063978 to 785, and you speak at that page of 20,000 people from Udong being resettled in cooperatives, and further that 40,000 from the northern zone fled from there to Kampong Tom. Now, these numbers are, of course, an estimate because there would never be precisely 20,000 or 40,000. But I'm interested also in your how you reached these conclusions and included this information in the book about Kratchie, Kompong Cham and Udong.
Well, Udong was relatively simple. There is documentary material, but that came from an interview with Pipong in Malay, and he described, I remember him saying, that the evacuation of Udong was particularly important because it was a kind of trial run. It proved that the population of an urban centre could be evacuated and put into cooperatives without, as he put it, any great problems arising. And so that was important. Let me just look at for the other ones. Give me a second. Kompong Tom, I have a feeling, I'm pretty sure, was an American estimate. From American intelligence, the 40,000 people who came out of the northern zone and went to Kompong Tom. There was quite a lot of American intelligence material. It was not always accurate, but they did have informants who told them what was happening in the Khmer Rouge zones, particularly after 1973. They made overflights of the areas along the border with Vietnam, which enabled them to draw certain conclusions about what was happening in Khmer Rouge areas. And the fact that conditions were difficult and that people tried to flee in some cases, that is all in American documents, which, because they were not designed for public consumption, have a certain credibility.
Now, you speak of a meeting of the Central Committee convened by Pol Pot in this same period, September 1973. The trial chamber has no record of this meeting. Are you... and you note some very important decisions that arose from that meeting of the Central Committee. Can you give us any help on the source or availability of that minute?
Yes, there are references in confessions which are in the DC Cam archives. I mean, they're very scattered, but there are, I think, my memory serves me, 3 or 4 references to the 1973 Central Committee meeting. And I also, again, was given information in interviews, notably by Pipon, who was present at most of these meetings in the period 1973, 74, 75.
Well, you record that Central Committee meeting as making some decisions. First, that traders were to be sent to work in the fields so that the Communist Party of Kampuchea could control distribution of goods and prevent capitalism. Secondly, that, and this is noted at page 257, the ERNs for which are English 00396457 and French 00639737. And that was that there was a unanimous decision to evacuate Phnom Penh and other Cambodian towns as soon as they were liberated. And the third of those decisions in that Central Committee meeting marked the first time that the Central Committee authorised the killing of one of its own members, Prasit. That's at page 260, English 00396468 and French 00639790-91. Now, those three decisions are of interest because they lead to other policies that were said to have been developed by the leaders of democratic Kampuchea and applied during the regime. Is there any comment you would like to make on any of those three decisions?
I think the decision to execute Prasit, the Central Committee member from the Southwest, was a kind of tipping point. And if you look back at Chinese communist history, there is an exactly similar tipping point in 1930, when for the first time there was a question of four provincial leaders, again, who were following policies different from those which the Chinese party's leadership at that time wished to follow. And the judgment that the Chinese party made was that these four leaders were, by their behavior, objectively counter-revolutionary, and therefore they should be removed, they should be eliminated. And in China, and there are many similarities between the Chinese Communist movement in the 1930s and what happened in democratic Kampuchea in the 1970s. They are the two closest parallels, far closer than anything to do with the Cultural Revolution, which was completely different. But in both cases, a communist party which was under great pressure, which had very few experienced cadres, reacted by starting to kill its own when placed in a situation of pressure. So for me, the killing of Prasit in 1973 was really the beginning of the internal purges which went on to devour the Kampuchean Communist Party.
I want to turn now to a general topic, which is the variety of reasons given for the evacuation of Phnom Penh on the 17th of April 1975. First, arising from those population movements as various parts of the country were liberated, we have been told repeatedly that the population of Phnom Penh was increased enormously over the year or so before April 1975. Would it be correct to say that a large number of those people would be peasants as well as town dwellers from, say, Udong and other towns and cities that have been evacuated?
The overwhelming majority of those living in Phnom Penh in early 1975 were peasants who had fled from the countryside, had fled, first of all, the American bombing, in some cases, had then fled from the war, and had, in a way, voted with their feet. And this was one of the factors which influenced what happened to them later, because to the Khmer Rouge, and indeed, I think it was, who was it? Hu Yun said in a broadcast early in 1975, you have to make a choice. If you choose to join Lon Nol's people in Phnom Penh, then we, the Khmer Rouge, will regard you as having made that choice. If you choose to come to the revolution, then you will be welcomed. It's a very oversimplified distinction, but it did lead to the categorization of new people who were treated less well later because they had taken refuge with Lon Nol, as against the old people who had stayed with the Khmer Rouge and supported the revolution. If one estimates roughly, if there were 3 million people in Phnom Penh in the spring of 75, something like 600,000 were real city dwellers. The remainder had come in from the countryside. And it is true that once peace had been restored, a lot of those people in from the countryside, even if they had discredited themselves with the Khmer Rouge by choosing to be in Phnom Penh, they were not unhappy to go back to their villages. So the evacuation affected the two different groups very differently. For the city people, it was incomprehensible, the beginning of everything in their world crashing down around their feet. For the peasants, the great majority, it was going home.
So it's better to classify the people from Phnom Penh as new people than as city dwellers, given this uneven distribution of the population, and they all shared a similar fate, whether they were true urbanites or peasants.
They initially shared a similar fate to the extent that they were all sent out of the city with very few belongings, which again affected the city dwellers who had a lot of belongings much more than the poor who had none. But the true city dwellers were more likely to be educated, therefore to be suspect. And I would like to say that the business of suspecting educated people, in the image of suspecting people who had glasses, was not unique to the Khmer Rouge. It happened in the 1940s with the Isarak, when there are perfectly verifiable accounts of intellectuals or people with glasses being taken off buses and killed or beaten up because they were intellectuals. And I think one has to remember that to the many poor villagers in Cambodia, there wasn't much difference between the rich and the educated, because both of them looked down on the poor. So those who were seen as rich and educated always had a much harder time than the new people who were poor. And when I say a harder time, in many cases they were simply killed.
Now, as I've indicated, there have been quite a number of reasons recorded for the evacuation of Phnom Penh. You mention at page 271, English ERN 003964479 and French 00639804205, that soldiers went from house to house telling the inhabitants that they must leave just for 2 or 3 days on the pretext that the Americans planned to bomb the city. Now, we've heard a great deal of information already from a variety of witnesses about the evacuation of Phnom Penh. So what I want to focus on is the credibility of that reason given, that is, that bombing might be about to occur. And you do discuss this to some extent in your book. Could you give us your comments on that?
The explanation was knowingly false. There was never any possibility of bombing, but not only that, the Khmer Rouge knew there was no possibility of bombing. The reason for telling people you are just going for 2 or 3 days was to make it easier to persuade them to go, was also to persuade them not to take lots of belongings with them, because if you're going only for a few days, you don't need to. You think you're going to be coming back. There is a parallel in Vietnam where similar reasoning was used earlier on to move people out of, I think it was the old imperial capital, Hue. It's whether the Cambodians were aware of that, whether the Khmer Rouge were aware of that and used that precedent, I don't know. Very probably not. They may well not have known about it, but it did happen elsewhere on a very small scale before. In Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, they had taken a decision to send all the city dwellers into the countryside, and whatever was going to make it easier to persuade them to go, they would say.
Now, I'm not sure. Yes, in fact, you are familiar with this document which you refer to in your book. It's a document E3/196, Statement of the Communist Party of Kampuchea to the Communist Workers' Party of Denmark, delivered in July 1978 by Nguyen Chia, described as Deputy Secretary of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. At page 30 of that, I'll quote you something that Nguyen Chia says. He said, "It is more widely known that the USA planned to seize power from us 6 months after the liberation. The plan involved joint action on the part of the USA, the KGB, and Vietnam. There was to be a combined struggle from inside and outside, but we smashed the plan. Immediately after liberation, we evacuated the cities." Now, I don't need your comment on the unusual suggestion that the USA, KGB, and Vietnam all cooperated at that period. But what do you have to say about his comments there? Are they in keeping, his reasons given, are they in keeping with the earlier decision that we have no formal record of concerning evacuation of Phnom Penh and other Cambodian towns, or is there some other, something else you would like to comment on?
Well, the third and fourth sentences in that paragraph where he says there was to be combined struggle from inside and outside, but we smashed the plan. Immediately after liberation, we evacuated the cities. I think that can be read literally. One of the effects of the evacuation of Phnom Penh and other cities, but particularly Phnom Penh, was to destroy completely the networks that were reporting to Western intelligence agencies. They're American, there are CIA officials who have gone on the record as saying every bit of information we were getting from Phnom Penh just ended overnight. So to that extent it's true. This idea of a combined struggle that plays into the explanation, the narrative that the Khmer Rouge leadership built for itself to explain or to justify the purges carried on within the party. But those purges started later. They weren't 6 months after liberation. They really developed later on.
Kyo Sampon himself, in his monograph, Cambodia's Recent History, gives some explanations about the fall of Phnom Penh and other urban areas. He describes at page 55 of that monograph, ERN English 00103750 and French 00595427228. He says that he was unaware of the decision to evacuate Phnom Penh. Now, during your discussions with him, did you talk about his knowledge in advance of the decision to evacuate Phnom Penh?
I think Mr. Kyo Sampon has been very consistent in his the version of events that he has given, in what he said to me and in what he's written there, which was that he was not involved in the evacuation of Phnom Penh. He told me that he actually came to Phnom Penh very much later, after the evacuation had taken place, which is broadly consistent with what you just told me. Whether one should take that as the version which Mr. Kyo Sampon wishes to have remembered, or whether one should take it as strict historical fact, is a different issue.
In that monograph, he describes, this is at the same page, that by the end of March 1975, I was invited to the general headquarters of the Communist Party of Kampuchea to the west of Udong to follow the last offensive against the capital more closely. And he goes on to say that every day he followed the battle's progression on the radio, and I quote, "On April 17, at around 9 o'clock, our hearts were filled with joy. We had heard the voices of commanders of various units speak from several points inside the capital." He then describes how, because it was so hot that day, he hid from the sun in his hut, but that he listened to soldiers who returned from Phnom Penh, describing huge numbers of people leaving the city, banknotes being thrown out of windows like confetti, and he speaks of his complete astonishment at the reports. Do you have any further comment in addition to what you have just said about his surprise at these reports?
I can only confirm that Mr. Kyo Sampon did also tell me that he was at the Pol Pot's headquarters west of Phnom Penh, that he was with Pol Pot on April the 17th. I think there's no doubt that he did not go into Phnom Penh on the 17th. He went later, following day, or a day later. As to his surprise, well, I would be surprised that he was surprised.
2 pages further on, he says, "I was greatly surprised to learn during my talks with CPK executives after April 1975 that the superior level cooperatives had been used in the liberated regions since 1973. And he comments that it was a necessary policy, Again, are you or are you not surprised at his surprise?
I have to say I'm surprised at his surprise. Mr. Kyu Sompon was with the upper leadership. I think it's very difficult to imagine that he could not have been aware of what was happening in the Khmer Rouge areas. He did travel. He spent a lot of time with the leadership. I think it's true he was not a member of the standing committee. He was not at that time in the very top level of the leadership. But I think he must have been aware of what was transpiring. Though I would say it is supposition. I cannot hold up my hand and say I know that he knew. And I think that's important to say. I'm supposing that would be logical. That's all I can say.
He mentions in the same monograph that at page 57, speaking to Pol Pot privately and conveying his misgivings to him about the evacuation of Phnom Penh. And to be fair to Kyo Sompon, he had spoken of his misery at hearing what the vast hordes who were being evacuated from Phnom Penh on that very hot day were going through. So this is him speaking to Pol Pot a little later of his regrets and despair. He said that Pol Pot told me the underlying reason for emptying the cities. It was part of a collectivization policy that had already reached a certain level in the countryside before the end of the war. This collectivization policy had enabled the CPK to maintain control over the rice supply and thus had provided it with an important weapon to confront the Vietnamese military and to force the Vietnamese to respect Cambodia's sovereignty while Vietnamese troops operated in our country. Is that a policy, does that describe the collectivization policy in a way that you are familiar with?
I think one spin-off from the collectivization policy was indeed that the CPK had control of rice supplies, and therefore the Vietnamese could only get rice for their troops in Cambodia through the CPK. It was a spin-off. It wasn't the fundamental reason for collectivization, which was ideological. It was communal ownership as against individual ownership. It was communism as against capitalism. It was equality for all citizens. One may put that in inverted commas, but as against differences in living standards, in levels of wealth. That the evacuation of Phnom Penh was justified because it was part of the collectivization policy. I think that is stretching it. The reasons for the evacuation of the cities were fundamentally different.
At page 287 of the English copy of your book, you describe two contradictory sets of reasons offered by Pol Pot. He told Westerners that the action was not pre-planned. It was the realization that a food shortage was imminent and that there was a plan by US lackeys to attack us that prompted it. You go on to say that none of that was true. But first, the source of those comments by Pol Pot giving reasons for the evacuation.
I'm sorry to hesitate. This copy of the book that I'm looking at does not have the absolutely complete notes, which are only available electronically. I'm sure that quote, it is obviously from a document. He was talking to a Western delegation. Which Western delegation, I cannot tell you now, but if the court is interested, I can certainly find the relevant source.
Well, first of all, Mr. Short, I recognise that this book was published some time ago, and you can't be familiar with every single detail. So I certainly accept that you won't have the source for every detail, but if and when you do, it's very interesting for me to learn that. You go on to talk about the reason given that the city was evacuated because a food shortage was imminent, and you say none of that was true. Not only were food supplies adequate, but it was far more difficult logistically for the Khmer Rouge to provide grain to moving columns of deportees than it would have been if they had stayed put. Can you just discuss that statement where you quite categorically say this is completely inaccurate?
Food was not available in enormous quantities in Phnom Penh. There was an airlift which had come to an end. Nonetheless, there were sufficient reserves to feed the city population at least for a matter of days. Leave aside the possibility that they could have asked for food to be sent in, for rice to be sent in from elsewhere. But a static population is, by definition, much easier to feed than some millions of people who are streaming out of the city in all directions when no medical facilities have been provided for that exodus, when no food reserves along the route have been provided, when there are going to areas where there are no warehouses with food to feed them. All that is going to make it much more difficult. Basically, the reason for, I say categorically, it was harder is, I think, fairly self-evident.
Kyo Sampon comments on this very issue, namely the reason given for the evacuation of Phnom Penh being lack of food, in his Chapter 5 of Considerations on the History of Cambodia, E3/16, at page 64, which is English ERN 00498-283 and French 00643-890. And he says, for a long time already in the countryside, a large part of the land had been abandoned and no rice could be grown. 3 million people in general did not have enough to eat. In the city, 3 million other people were gradually starving. This is why Pol Pot said, and he gives this as a quote, "Continuing to stay in the city will lead to danger of famine. So then evacuating the city is better in order to avoid the danger of famine and the danger of rebellion." Kyo Samphan goes on to say, if there was a rebellion, then Vietnam clearly would have come to intervene. So there's a gloss on that reason. So is there any further comment you would like to make on that quote?
I think the last part is extremely significant. The danger of rebellion is a way of putting it. The fact was that if the city people were scattered in the countryside and the networks among them were all broken, they were very much easier to control. And any possibility of resistance to Khmer Rouge policies was greatly diminished. So if you read rebellion in that sense, it's absolutely true. That was a key reason, perhaps not the absolutely dominant reason, but it was a key reason for the evacuation of the cities. Famine, I find wholly unconvincing.
Realistically, how long would it take to move several million people out of the city, settle them, and then produce food sufficient to eat, if indeed there was a huge crisis over food at that point? Are we talking weeks or months?
The President, the experts, please wait. The defense lawyer, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know I'm not supposed to object to any questions asked by the trial chamber to the expert. However, I would like to make an observation that I'm not sure if the answer to this question will fall within the realms of the expertise of this particular witness. He's an historian, and the way, well, I think you have my point.
Well, I won't pursue that question, and Mr. Korpi, I accept that it might not fall within the realms of the expert's expertise, but perhaps within his common sense to be able to ask that and answer that question. Given that many of the reasons presented for the evacuation of Phnom Penh have been around food, was the possibility of foreign aid for food ever considered seriously by the new democratic Kampuchean regime? Over history, especially last century, there have been a number of examples of vast quantities of food being moved to a place where there has been conflict and there are hundreds of thousands of people in danger of starving. So was that prospect ever discussed?
Some rice did arrive from China. It was in limited quantities. Nonetheless, some you could qualify that as food aid. But the CPK leadership, which made a point of honor of self-sufficiency, was absolutely against the idea of, as they would have said, going begging bowl in hand to foreign countries when they had just won, in their terms, a great victory. I think there is an internal logic in their position. Now, you may say it offers very little to the people who were hungry. It was a theoretical position rather than a matter of practical help for a population which was suffering. But that, again, is consistent with the policies of the CPK throughout the period when they were coming to power and throughout the period that they were in power. They wished to make a very different kind of country, a country which in their view would be egalitarian, pure, wonderful, in inverted commas, the intentions were good, but there was no concern for the suffering along the way.
Other reasons, perhaps a further confirmation of a reason given for the evacuation was quoted by you again at page 287, which is English 00396494 and French 00639824-25, where you quote Pol Pot as telling Chinese journalists the following: "Until we had smashed all kinds of enemy spy organizations, we did not have enough strength to defend the revolutionary regime." In the hierarchy of reasons given, how important do you think this particular reason, that is, disabling spy networks, might be?
I think it's probably second equal or second or third. If you put the first reason as an ideological imperative to equalize the city and the countryside by essentially eliminating the city with all its turpitudes and filth, that was the key. Secondly, to disable spy networks, which, as I mentioned, they did very effectively, and at the same time to break up the city population so it could not resist.
Ieng Sari discussed the reasons for the evacuation with you when you interviewed him, and at that same page 287, he said that it was noted that the failure of the proletariat to exercise dictatorship over the bourgeoisie was the reason for the overthrow of the Paris Commune. So that's going back a bit in history. And he said that, and you quote this, Pol Pot would not make the same mistake. So is that a significant reason or a blend of the reasons you've already listed?
I think it's it's putting the third reason I gave to break up the networks among what I called the city population, in other words, the bourgeoisie, so that he could not resist. And yes, the Paris Commune in 1870-71 was something that they had in mind. Mr. Khieu-Samphan, Pol Pot, Ieng Sari were all students in Paris at a time when the 80th anniversary of the Paris Commune was being celebrated. It was a subject that interested them a lot, and they, like communists from other Asian countries, did draw lessons from it.
On the next page, 288, you conclude that the goal of the evacuation was not to destroy but to transmute. Pol Pot wrote later that the evacuation was, and it's a quote, an extraordinary measure, one that one does not find in the revolution of any other country. And you go on to say it was the nub of the party's political and economic strategy, which was then being elaborated at a series of standing committee meetings, first held in the railway station and subsequently in other locations. Do you want to comment on Pol Pot's statement?
When I wrote that in my book, I thought at that time, and I still think, it's important to emphasize that the goal of the Khmer Rouge was not to destroy a large part of the Cambodian population. They didn't set out to kill everybody. They set out to change the country, in other words, to transmute. And Pol Pot was very proud of the fact that they had done something by evacuating the cities, in particular, which had been done nowhere else. And when when Mao, late in 1975, met the Vietnamese leader, Le Duan, Mao said to Le Duan, could you have done that? And Le Duan said no. And Mao said, no, we couldn't either. So for the Khmer Rouge, for the leadership, the fact that they had done something, that they had taken a radical step to transform Cambodian society, which no other communist party was capable of taking, or had taken, was important.
President, thank you, Mr. Expert. The time is appropriate for a short break. We shall take a break now and return at 11. Court officer, could you assist the expert during the break and have him returned to the courtroom at 11 a.m.
សូមក្រោកឈរ